Join me for a conversation with the lead designer of Tales of Xadia.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. Okay, guys, I hope you know by now, I create resources that help role players, that help game masters. You can find those at dicegeeks.com, amazon.com, or drivethroughrpg.com. All you have to do is search for the Book of Random Tables. You will find a whole bunch. Besides random tables, I have dungeon maps. I have adventure seeds, all kinds of things that you need to jumpstart your tabletop RPG sessions. All right, I have a great interview today, so here it is. My guest today is the Cortex creative director and lead designer on Tales of Xadia, Cam Banks. Cam, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt. I really am glad to be here.
Oh, absolutely. It's my pleasure. When did you first learn that you loved tabletop role-playing games?
That's a really good question. I was probably about 10 years old, and that's a long time ago. I believe it was because we were walking through a bookshop, and I was very much one of those kids in the late 70s, early 80s who loved bookstores and just lived in them the whole time. There was a huge display here in New Zealand about Dungeons and Dragons. I was not allowed to buy any of it, but I did see an Endless Quest book, and that was my first exposure to D&D, and role-playing kind of soon came after that. It's one of those things where you kind of sneak in the back door when you have parents who are sort of unsure about what it is you're doing. And my friends at school, we all got into it pretty soon after that.
Well, that's great. I love those Endless Quest books as well. And of course, I came into D&D when I was 9, and that would have been around 1982. So there is a bit of a similarity there. So that's interesting to hear. And of course, back in those days, it was Dungeons and Dragons. And it is interesting, though, that you said, you then kind of got into it and started afterwards. What do you think it was about tabletop RPGs or just Dungeons and Dragons specifically that just captured kind of your imagination about it?
I'm always wondering about whether it's because you get to play as somebody else or because there's a control over a story that you otherwise would have to sit and just be an audience for. And I think it's more the latter than the former. Mm-hmm. I gravitate towards being the GM more often than a player, although I have no problem being a player. I love playing games. But I think it also comes down to just like setting up a world and seeing what happens in it when you present the sort of story ideas and situations that people would otherwise have in movies and TV and comic books, and let the players make the decisions this time instead of whoever it is who decided to make the character do that stupid thing in the movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you were kind of drawn to GMing or dungeon mastering pretty quickly?
Yes. A friend of mine and I, he managed to get the box set for the red box set for D&D before I did, and he also had found the friend who had arrived from America, and that's a huge, big, special, unique thing. Oh no, we have the American friend, and he had brought all his D&D books with him, so he kind of cornered the market first on getting that stuff and became the DM before I did, and it was probably about 6 months before I had a shot. But in that time, I was just planning on and reading everything I could, absorbing every D&D module I could, and so on. And at the same time, the Warlock of Firetop Mountain and other books like it from Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson, from the founders of Games Workshop, those books had come out too. And I had dissected those in a way to try and make them kind of quasi-compatible with D&D. The earliest homebrew I could imagine was that. And that was my little project. So obviously I had to run that for my friend. And so we all kind of got together and tried that out. So it took a while before I could get into the DM seat. But once I was in there, that was not a thing that I wanted to let go of.
Yeah. I've had similar experiences as well. Although I'm getting to play a lot more these days because we've had kind of an insurgence of younger people into the hobby who want to get their hands on the GM chair, the DM chair, and I am more than happy to let somebody else run a game after 25 years of being kind of a GM only kind of situation. So, but no, that's really interesting. And I'm thinking though, of course, a lot of people, play, a lot of people run games, but then you've become a game designer. Was it kind of related to that first bit of taste of taking some Steve Jackson material and just kind of homebrewing it? Was that a little taste of maybe a foretaste of you becoming a game designer?
Oh, totally. I used to fill up school exercise books, math books and things with notes and things on adventures, but it soon quickly became, well, how could I tell a G.I. Joe story with this game? So I would homebrew my own G.I. Joe RPG or whatever else. I think I called it Tanks and Tactics or something ridiculous, but that sort of bug that you get from designing and cobbling together things is something that can stick with you for a long time, and it has for me. So yeah, absolutely homebrew stuff, and then trying to make my own games handwritten in these school books was my start, and it never stopped.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love a G.I. Joe role-playing game, and back in the day, I would have loved it too because I made up my characters, right? The G.I. Joe action figures in the 80s had the little card on the back with their specialties, and I would just make up my own soldiers. And I was like, why isn't there a role-playing game for this? Why isn't there a role-playing game?
It was called Action Man here in New Zealand because we were like a Commonwealth country.
Oh, yes.
So I didn't know that Snake Eyes was a G.I. Joe character until I sort of saw the comic books come from the American comic books. And I said, hey, that's an Action Man character. And they're like, oh, yeah, well, we had to change the name because it's not America.
Yeah. I learned about that just through some YouTube channel that talks about cartoons and toys from the 80s. And I didn't realize that they had changed the name. Of course, it makes total sense that you would change the name because it doesn't mean anything if you're not here in the United States. But yeah, that is incredible. But then, of course, you have continued on and you have designed a number of systems and worked on a number of games. And I would like to maybe just before we jump into Tales of Xadia a little bit, I would like to ask you kind of along the way of homebrewing and designing games and running games. Obviously, a lot of people who listen to the podcast, most are GMs. What are some of your, I don't know if you have one or two kind of go-to tips for a game master, just, if somebody's running something and they want to, kind of up their game, do you have some little tips or tricks that you could share real quick?
Yeah, over the years, a lot of that stuff has kind of, I've read a lot of people's sort of thoughts and theory on how to do these things, and it kind of filters in, and some of it sticks and some of it doesn't, and you read it again later on and remind yourself of it. So you lose track of where you find these things out. There's an idea of this accepted practice of how role-playing games should be run by certain people and GMs, and there are certain kinds of player, and you need to sort of figure out those things out. I think in general, though, you learn to have your own style of how you like to run games and what games will fit those games. It's true for me, at least, that the system that you play with makes a big difference to how the play experience comes out. A lot of folks will tell you that, a good GM can turn any game into a great fun experience and session will be just fine. But I think it can get in the way a lot if you're fighting really hard with the rules to make the story as fun for the players and for yourself. Mm-hmm. So I guess my first sort of suggestion would be, if you're going to be a GM, really, if the system is one you like, then you could absolutely run with it and do your fun things with it. But don't force yourself to run a game that you just don't like. you'll find over time that you'll just be hitting that wall so often that it won't be fun for you, even if your players are all super keen on it. So that's you're a player at the table too, right? It's one of those aphorisms that I like to tell people. It's not just other players plus you as some omnipotent God figure. You're a player, so are they. Your specific role in the game is to run these things and all the secondary characters and adjudicate rules and whatever. But if you're not having fun, then it's not a good time. So go with games that you like, settings and genres and rules and things that you like, and then mess around with those after that. I was recently asked to try something out, play a game for my local group, and I think it was Traveller, and I've always wanted to try running Traveller. I had never run Traveller before. It's a very old game. Mm-hmm. And we ran about 3 sessions, and I said, I'm done with this. I can't do this anymore. I thought it would be fun, but I couldn't have a good time, and it's because certain rules or certain things about it I didn't like. And my players could tell, right? They could tell that I wasn't having a good time, and I think that really does affect how much fun they have too. So, yeah, definitely get a rule set that you like. If you need to make changes, make those changes, but take care of yourself as a game master. I don't think anyone needs to sort of go through too much hard work and chores to have a good time at a table.
Yeah. I always try to let people know that if it's a chore, then something's wrong because you're playing a game and you should be having fun. And I think that's great advice, because while somebody may enjoy, say, playing in a fantasy setting, maybe they're more suited to run a game in a science fiction setting because, that's some more of their likes. So they know those stories better or something like that. So I think that's always something to keep in mind. Maybe that's when it's time in your gaming group, if you're just going to switch from a dungeon master or to a game master to a different one, and maybe the system changes as well. Maybe that person is not going to maybe they're going to struggle running a fantasy game and they need to run a science fiction game or vice versa or something like that. And I think that's great advice.
Yeah. I would certainly also not tell anyone to not change up the game or try something new, because that's the only way you'll find out something that you like. Yeah. I often feel that people sort of unnecessarily keep themselves to one rule set their entire life and not try things out. Yeah. If you try it and you like it, great. If you don't like it, then no harm, no foul, right? Go back to what you do like.
Yeah. And I think sadly sometimes people may feel like I know this system and I have all the books or something, like do I get a new system? And sometimes that can be some people can feel like they can't break out, but I definitely encourage people as well to try new games, play new games, because even I spent many years running the old Star Wars West End game. Many years running that. It's made me a better dungeon master when I come to fantasy or something like that. It's just that exposure to different genres and stuff can actually have a lot of crossover as well. And I don't think people think about that as often as they should. Yeah. And but now we are, to kind of jump to modern day. I introduced you as the Cortex creative director and the lead designer on Tales of Xadia. Why don't you kind of explain what those mean for the listeners out there?
Well, Cortex is a game that I've been working on for, a long time. And it's a set of rules which are, each time that I've designed a game for it, I've redesigned the rules a little bit or built it up from the ground up. And after a while, back with Margaret Weiss Productions, which is where I first got my gig as a game designer, I would take a game license that we'd acquired and I would turn it into a new game and build it with Cortex. After a while, people sort of thought, well, okay, is this the generic house system that you folks are using? And I'm like, well, kind of it is, but kind of it's not always the same each time I do it. But I realized that if I took all of those pieces and made them into one gigantic big box of Lego, it would be something really fun. And that's when Cortex Prime happened. And that was a Kickstarter I ran a few years ago. It was pretty successful. And, the end result now is this Cortex Prime game handbook, which you can get, that Fandom has published. Fandom brought me on and brought Cortex on, and we have done amazing things with it so far. And Tales of Xadia is the first actual licensed game that Cortex has had in many years since before, when it was Margaret Weis Productions had it. And the whole thing about having a game system that you can rebuild and build over again with different pieces, it's not just that the game can be switched to different genres, but all the game's stats and traits and everything about them, and different things about how combat works and how social interaction works, can all be modded and changed around. So it really does feel as if you've got all the building blocks for something that you can just put them together and you make a game out of it. And until Tales of Xadia was released, I don't think a lot of folks knew quite what the end result would be if they were to do that. And so we really wanted to show, okay, this is a prime example, no pun intended, of what Cortex can do if you use it the way that we intended to use it. So we have an amazing license with this amazing partner, Wonderstorm, who did the TV show Dragon Prince on Netflix, which has had 3 seasons already and has 4 coming more. This license is really neat. It's vibrant. It's fun. It's all ages. And it's the kind of thing that Cortex was just designed to really capture. And so with that in hand, now we're looking at this sort of community that's built up around Cortex, which really loves making things, but now can see an example firsthand of something which has been done with us. Excuse me. And then we'll then be able to take that idea and do the same thing for their own games at home.
Yeah, and I'm sure many listeners have heard of the Dragon Prince, so we will dive into that game here in a bit. But why don't you just tell us a bit about the system then? If there, I'm sure there are some listeners out there who are just unfamiliar with Cortex. So why don't you give us a few specifics on Cortex, and maybe what dice does it use, and what kind of sets it apart from some other RPG systems that are out there?
Yeah, sure. So apart from the fact that it's a complete, bunch of mods and things, like I said, at its heart, what it is, it's a dice pool game, and the dice that go into your dice pool come from different traits in your character sheet, and those dice are rated as they're traits rated in dice. So a die could be anywhere from a D4 through to D12, and this game doesn't use D20s at all, just uses the 4 through 8 to 12. And you might have a strength of D10 and a skill rating of, athletics of D6. And those 2 dice would go into your pool when you're doing anything that would be strength related and athletics related, for example. So the idea is that all the different things in your character that matter, that would make a difference to whether you succeed or fail, go into a dice pool, and then you get to roll those all together. You only have to add the 2 best dice that come up. You just look around and see what results you have. You take the 2 best ones and add them together, and that's your total. And at this point, someone has already rolled it. The GM or another player has rolled their own dice to set a difficulty. So it's an opposed dice pool kind of setup. And the cool thing I think about it is it isn't just one stat that's sort of dominating whether you succeed or fail. It's all the different parts of your character. And so if you've made a game where your parts of your character are very heavily emphasized towards things like beliefs or sort of moral attitudes and things, like Tales of Xadia has values as one of the prime trait sets in it, that factors a lot in your success or fail in anything you do in the game, versus having, say, a very heavily skill and equipment kind of based character. And the 2 things together, the immutability of which traits you have in your game and the fact that all those things can be contributing towards your success and failure, makes this different from a lot of games where it's just one skill check or one kind of attribute check.
No, that's really interesting. And sadly, just on a personal note, I have never gotten to play the Cortex system, but I have read some about it, and I do find it really interesting. And I think there is something among role players. I love being able to add as many dice as possible, and I don't know why that I don't know why that seems to be in the psychology of certain role players, but I love handfuls of dice. So I love where systems where you can add dice into dice pools. So I really enjoy that. Yeah, so I don't know why some people are obsessed with dice, but I am. So
there's something very much a tactile feel of that, which I think is very important. I mean, picking up a bunch of dice and rolling them it's good for keeping your hands busy. And if you have to do that every time it's your turn, great. Why not?
Yeah.
It's obviously not as useful if it's not your go and you keep stacking dice up, but that's fine. We accept that at the table too.
Yeah. And I do really love the fact that it's mainly opposed roles, because I think sometimes, well, at least back in the day before I was married and had 4 kids, and we had marathon sessions, by the end of the day, I could not, coming up with difficulty numbers for people to play against was like, was getting difficult. So I love the idea of opposed roles because it also, I think it also, it eliminates any type of favoritism that maybe the game master could kind of fall into, or players could sometimes think it's just like, oh, well, I wanted to do this and it was really hard, but they wanted to do that and it was really easy. But it was just like, hey, I'm rolling opposed dice. It's just dice. Yeah.
Which is funny because one of the things that's a core principle of Cortex is that you always roll your dice out in the open. There's no secret rolls behind a GM screen. There's no hidden fudging of dice, so as a GM, you kind of have this freedom to say, oh, well, look, that's what they rolled. I didn't cheat here. It's what happens. You can't blame me, which is hilarious because if you're rolling dice, whether it's on the table or the digital tools that we have, like for Cortex, anytime something comes up bad, you can't blame the player or the GM. You can just say, oh, that's the dice's fault. And that frees you a lot from this whole feeling of shame about, oh my gosh, I'm making this worse for my players.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, and I think too, a lot of times it may not even just be like favoritism or making it hard. It's just like, as a game master, you have like 100 decisions to make like every 5 minutes. So you're just like, oh, I totally forgot. I made that one roll hard a while ago and now I made this one easy. I just forgot about it. And so the opposed rolls, I really like that because I'm kind of all about taking pressure off the game master. That's what I love to talk about. That's what I like to talk about in a lot of the resources that I create, and a lot of the books that I make is that I like the idea of that you should be able to pull out a tabletop role-playing game and be able to play it right then, instead of saying, oh, well, I need to spend, 5 hours prepping before we can play a session. Because I want as many people to play tabletop role-playing games as possible.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. Yeah, there's 2 approaches to that. I guess one is to take all the roles away from the GM, which some people find terrible.
Yeah,
you're like, okay, that's fine. But the other one is, give them some tool or resource which lets them feel that it's not that hard to do it, and you can focus on cool descriptions and stories and funny accents and whatever.
Yes, absolutely. And we all remember the funny accents at the table, I'm sure.
No, I can't help it. I'm a New Zealander, so it comes cool.
Well, I think it's worse when like I'm trying to put on a New Zealand accent or or some kind of other accent. That's when things get really bad. And I will not attempt a New Zealand accent for you here on the podcast today. So I won't do that.
Very kind of you.
No problem. But, so we have Cortex, and now you have Tales of Xadia, which is based on the Dragon Prince that you mentioned. That is a Netflix series, which is quite incredible. Why don't you kind of give us maybe just a little overview of Tales of Xadia and what the setting is like and what kind of players can expect with that game?
Yeah, so it's a fantasy setting. It's got dragons, elves, magic, and fantasy creatures in it. It's different in a way because it does have its own history and its own lore that is somewhat familiar to anyone who's played fantasy games before, but also has a neat kind of setup where one half of this continent has been divided to the humans, and the humans have their own human kingdoms. And then all the magic and all the dragons and elves and things live on the other side of the continent and have their own side of it. And this division is marked by a border of mountains and, river of lava, and it's protected by the king of the dragons, and he's always watching over it. And the split happened because humans who can't use magic innately felt like they needed something to be able to measure up to the elves who are naturally attuned to 6 primal sources of magic in the world. And there's different kinds of elves for each different kind of primal source. The humans felt like they needed something, otherwise they would never be able to compete. And so in this history, I think it's the unicorns give the knowledge of magic to humans in the form of primal stones, which they can use to sort of do spells, but that wasn't enough. So they had to learn how to use dark magic, which is like a 7th source. And dark magic is drawing magic from the life force of magical creatures, which is innately awful kind of as an idea, but it's the only way humans can use magic themselves without having to rely on something like an artifact or something else. This led to the division. The dragons and the elves were, felt this was an abomination. You're taking magical creatures, using their magical power and life force, and using it to cast spells. So that's the whole background to it. The setting on the show is one where the human kingdoms are slowly sort of trying to figure out what to do about their constant friction and sort of a stalemate with the other side of the continent. And there are events that roll out which are quite tragic and so on, which sort of could lead to a war. And that's kind of where we start the show. The thing I like about it is it's very, very focused on interrelated characters and trying to sort of look at the different motivations and goals that each character has and why they're doing what they do. Some of them are motivated towards trying to bring peace and trying to sort of like heal the wounds of the past, and others are very much ambitious and want to achieve some kind of supremacy for themselves. But our main characters are young people, and they're a mixed group, and it's really neat to see that not only on the show, but also whenever we've had games we play. Everyone plays a mixture of elves and humans and tries to sort of figure out their own particular dynamic in the course of play. And the game really does zero in a lot of that. The fact that you have values as one of your main sets of character traits brings that kind of interpersonal drama right to the fore. And we think that's kind of important for the show and to keep the vibe going.
Mm-hmm. So the different character options, you mentioned a few. You said like humans and elves. What are some of the types of characters that people can play?
Well, the elves that we've revealed in the show have been the Sunfire elves, who are connected to the sort of sun magic, which is heat, light, sort of exposing truth and so forth. There are moon shadow elves who are associated with the moon, and there are skywing elves who have attunement with sky magic. There are also other elves like earthblood and tidebound and so forth, but we do include rules for earth blood elves in the book, but they haven't shown up on the first 3 seasons yet. So we kind of scooped that a bit, which is quite neat. So generally you can play a skywing elf, a moonshadow elf, or a sunfire elf, or make an earthblood elf if you want one. The other side of the coin is humans, and there are 5 different human kingdoms with their own kind of cultures, which kind of are really interesting and different. And you can play any one of those kinds of humans as well. So you can't play like a dwarf or a halfling or anything else, but you do have that option of quite a variety of different people from many different kinds of backgrounds within each of those places. So no 2 characters really end up being the same.
Okay. And then you mentioned a bit about the values. Could you kind of describe that a little bit more and how that shapes the characters a bit more?
Yeah, values are things which you kind of decide, you rate them with dice just like other traits. So anywhere from a D4 through a D12. and those indicate just how much you're invested in that in life, and how much it really affects the things that you do. And the values are things like devotion, liberty, truth, glory, and so on. And these 6 traits, anything that you do, you always figure out, why am I doing this? What's motivating me to do this? Am I doing this out of love for the person who I'm trying to stop? Am I doing this because this is a case of trying to assert justice on a situation that you felt was unjust? And as well as that, you assign just a very short statement for your character about what they feel that value represents to them. So you'll have a value statement as well. And that just makes one of the dice that goes in your dice pool. So I'm doing something, I'm going to try to stop someone from doing something terrible. I'm doing this because they're threatening someone that I care about. So I'm using devotion as a value instead of, say, truth. And I use that devotion die rating into my dice pool. The thing that's interesting about this is that it does make you think about why your character is doing what they're doing. It adds a bit of a role-playing kind of aspect. It doesn't really matter if you find that you're using your highest die rating value all the time. It just means you're playing your character very strongly towards that specific kind of aspect, and that's fine too. Mm-hmm. So it's not going to break the game if, for example, you have a D10 in truth and you're always doing it because I want to know what the truth is. But if the rest of the players and the narrator of the game are going to say, well, is it about the truth or is it because you want vengeance on this person? So it does matter what your intent is too.
Okay. And that is interesting because I think there's always some kind of aspect of tabletop role-playing games where we're trying to get players to really think like their characters, not like necessarily think about themselves, think about their characters and what would that character do. And so I find systems like that very interesting because it really does make you think about what your character is doing, because I think, sometimes if you just make a character and you're not thinking about some of those things, that leads into some situations where usually when I was a teenager, the party is in front of the king and somebody just says, well, I attack the king. And you're just like, wait, no, you wouldn't. Your character wouldn't. Maybe you are, maybe you would, I guess, but your character wouldn't. And so I think that is an interesting solution. Is that kind of the idea? Maybe not in that extreme, but is that something you're trying to address with the value kind of system like that?
Yeah, and also these value die ratings will change and move up and down through play too. Your character may start out with a D10 or D12 in truth, and over time, that becomes way less important to your character than mastery, for example, of themselves or of their own skills or their abilities. And so when one will step up a die rating from a D8 to D10 or a D10 to D12, another one has to step down to make up for that shift. And in play, the way this often comes out is you can question your value. You can say, I don't know if what I've previously thought is actually true. And so when that happens, you get 3 of the dice into your dice pool, not just 1. But after that die roll, the die rating will step down because for a short time, you're kind of like in flux. You don't really know if you really think that about that specific kind of part of your life or not. And then at the end of the session, you'll sort of refigure these things out. Will you stay 1 step down and then from now on, it's not quite as important to you? Or will you keep it at the rating it was, but you must now rewrite what your statement about it is? I have changed my mind about truth. I think truth is pointless. Truth is all illusion. But that still matters. I mean, that's still what you think about truth. So therefore, it does matter to that value.
Oh no, that's really interesting, and I like that. And it can happen after each session.
Yeah, I think we looked into it and it made more sense for some of the stuff to be figured out over the course of a tale, which is what we call adventures. So at the end of the tale, you sort of figure out a lot of stuff and whether these things your character will grow and change and some of their characters will shift around. But it's end of the session, you had to decide whether these things change. So from session to session, your values may change. But at the end of the adventure, you'll sort of reassert certain parts of your character and roll to see whether you've improved some traits or others have moved around in a different way.
Okay, and I was just going to ask about that. Is there character advancement then?
Yeah, that's what growth is, and you only get growth dice which go into a pool of their own, which you roll at the end of the tail. You get growth dice from questioning your values and from taking stress. And stress is a little bit like this game's version of health, except it's across not just injury, but also includes being afraid, being angry, being insecure, and so forth. And when you take stress as a result of things that have happened in the game, when you recover it, that recovered stress goes into growth pool. So if someone helps you get over something, or if you get better with something, it kind of, you've learned something from that experience. You've learned something from going through a period when you were angry. You've learned something from when you were hurt badly in a fight. And so that goes towards your growth pool. And your growth dice then get rolled, and you choose one part of your character sheet that you want to change or improve. And then you can roll that way. So it's kind of like the reward for putting yourself into situations where you question whether you think these things are true or not, and the reward for throwing yourself into situations where you would actually get, take some stress and then recover, is that your character will improve. You don't get better by not putting yourself in some kind of risk or opportunities for growing yourself normally.
Okay. No, interesting. No, that was really, really neat. I really like the sound of that. I'm thinking too now, with Tales of Xadia, do you have is there anything like running some of these, like the value system or that, like any tips for the game masters? Maybe, like I would be new to running kind of a value system like that, even though I've been running games since I was 9 years old. But what kind of tips or something like that would you offer? Maybe does there come times when you have to like push maybe one of your players to say, actually, is that kind of the role of a game master in that situation, to like to say, really, really you're acting with truth, or isn't it more glory this time, or something like that?
Yeah, that really is what it is like. A lot of the time you're going to be some kind of coach in some ways for people to understand which of these values and which attributes and which specialties and things that they use are most appropriate. But you don't want to sort of tell someone you must use these different things, I don't think, at least in this game, because I want people to come up with their own reasons for how they justify what they're trying to do. And you want to reconcile that with the stats, obviously, right? If you say, I want to go, I'm so mad, I want to attack him and just force him to the ground and tell him to reveal the secret. You can't say that's about, devotion, because it makes no sense. Where is that? But with some work, players get used to this pretty quickly, I found, and it doesn't take a lot of time to think about it once you get through it. The other thing that you can do as a GM or a narrator, as we call them in Tales of Xadia, you can make that the outcome reflects the choices of which dice they put in there in the first place. So if they go with something with devotion, then the outcome should somehow tie back into a devotion kind of theme, right? So follow up on what kind of action, which dice they put into the pool to begin with, and make the outcome of the roll flavored that way.
Okay. And how would you do something like that? What would be an example? So I use devotion.
Yeah.
How would you flavor that? I don't know if you have an example.
Yeah. So like if you felt that the reason you're angry attacking someone is because of your devotion for, say, your sister, right, who you feel this person has wronged, then you have it so that, say you roll and you succeed and you manage to force them to reveal something. They might say, I did it because your sister has always been the one that I cherish the most, and I could never tell you the secret because I would think you would drive us apart. And it's like it becomes a revelation from the part of the of your game master character that is sort of flavored on the whole idea of why your PC was doing it, right? It's like you don't suddenly make it about, oh, I did it because I'm an evil person, haha. That doesn't have anything to do with devotion. And I think it would be more interesting if the players' choices as to why their character is motivated were borne out in the outcome of the scene too.
Okay. No, I understand. I think that's really interesting, and I can see where that kind of play can really pull you in, and really having rules kind of built around that, and then using some of your own judgment there. I really see how that can pull players into it. Just we've come down here, we're almost at time. Is there something maybe about Tales of Xadia that you that I haven't asked you that you really want people to know about?
Well, I think it'd be a shame if we glossed over the fact that this book is absolutely gorgeous too. Okay. Excuse me. T. Collier, who is our art director, managed to get an amazing lineup of artists, and the layout is just gorgeous. It's very much like the show. We got concept artists who work on Dragon Prince to be our key artists for this product, and it really does show in there too. Dan Telfer, who is my co-author of the book, he is our narrative lead in the Cortex group, which means his job is to make sure that the background and setting and the stories and the ideas for the tales are really strong and that we have that content in there. He managed to work with Wonderstorm very closely to get all of the lore and the secrets and the fun things from the show that people may not even know about into this book, so that there's a lot of sort of setting material which was revealed for the first time in Tales of Xadia. So I love making games that work in certain ways. I love writing rule books and designing rules and play experience. But having Dan and T and Amanda and Sally, our editors, bring that to life and actually making it have content and substance is fantastic. So I'm a huge fan of my team, and I always want to give them a shout out.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I guess one final question that just occurred to me. Are there any specific challenges or maybe or advantages when you tackle a licensed property as versus, if you're creating up your own world? Is there some challenges that you really enjoy when you tackle kind of a licensed property?
Licensing properties is pretty much all I've ever done, really. Oh, okay. I mean, in one way or another, I've always worked on something that someone else has originally made, and I've taken that and either made a game for it or revived a game that used to be around, so I have done not as much of my own original creations, and I keep getting told by people, do more often that. Well, I just have fun playing in sandboxes, right? Yeah. So the challenge is really just to make sure that you honor and respect the property in a way that really does show that you care about it and you know what it is. And if anything, I would say my superpower is that I can take something like a multimedia property and make a game out of it by becoming an expert as fast as I possibly can. That's a really good skill, I think, at least in this sort of thing. Whether I always succeed or not is up to the judgment of people who are fans. I think that's always the case. But I really do love the fact that people get the opportunity to play in their own worlds. And to do that, you have to sort of meet certain criteria. You've got to walk within certain guidelines. You always need to make sure that everyone's approving it on the part of the licensor. So we are so fortunate that Wonderstorm works so closely with us that everything that's in this book, whether it's just like the shading of a certain kind of logo, for example, or the inclusion of one character or another, has been past people who acknowledge that that's good, have checked that against their own sort of interior show Bibles and things, and have said, yep, good, let's go for it. So yeah, super appreciate that. I think that's the key, the cheat challenge. You have to basically love the property, you have to respect it, and you have to give it the attention that it deserves, so the fans will realize that it's good.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, where can people find Tales of Xadia?
You can find Tales of Xadia at talesofxadia.com, which is our website. You can buy it there. You can also then try out the game for free. There's a sample rules primer. We have an amazing digital toolset that our digital team has created. They spent so much time working on this. You can create characters and put your information in these character sheets, and you can click dice and they roll on the screen. It's amazing. It's really amazing. So go try that out. We have 13, a dozen, I think, maybe now 13 sample pre-gen characters, which are really well made. So you can really, everything you need to know to play the game and try it out is online, and then you can order it through our website.
Okay, and I will be sure to put links to talesofxadia.com in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who is listening right now can head over there and you will be able to find Tales of Xadia. Well, Cam, it was an absolute pleasure getting to speak with you and to hear some of your Game Master knowledge and lore and to learn about Tales of Xadia. So thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, it was a pleasure, Ben. Thank you so much for inviting us.
All right, there you go, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Cam today. It was awesome just to be able to pick his brain about game mastering and game design. As I mentioned in the show, you can find links to Cam's works and the Tales of Xadia in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So head over there right now, check those out. All right, guys, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get treated to some free PDFs, free dungeon maps, and each and every Friday, I will send you an email update letting you know what is going on here at Dice Geeks. All right, now, guys, if you would like to support the show in some way, you know, it does cost money to produce this show, and it takes a lot of my time as well. If you would like to support the show in some way, I would greatly appreciate that. You can like, rate, review, or subscribe to it in Spotify or Stitcher or Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Those things really help. They help more than you would actually think, but they help the show out immensely, and I would greatly appreciate it. Also, if you have the means, you can support the show financially at patreon.com/dicegeeks. All right, guys, I really hope you enjoyed this week's episode. I thank you so much for listening, and until next Wednesday, keep gaming!